Hello, everyone. I am the Whisperer, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The last faint hum of the antique clock always settled the quiet house for sleep. Yet tonight, it stretched on, a silence that resonated too deeply. It was a peculiar stillness, unlike the usual gentle hush that embraced my isolated cottage. A stillness that felt less like the absence of sound and more like an active, breathing presence, a vast, velvety dark pressing in from all sides. The scent of old wood smoke and damp earth, usually a comforting embrace in the evenings, seemed to thin, dissolving into this profound, watchful quiet. My favorite armchair, worn smooth by years of contemplation, cradled me in its familiar embrace, the wool blanket soft against my skin, but even its familiar weight felt subtly altered, lighter, as if it too were being consumed by the deepening void. The single candle on the small table flickered, a hesitant flame against the encroaching darkness, and beyond the window, the moon hung like a distant, bruised fruit, its light absorbed by the hungry air. I remember distinctly the usual progression of sounds as night descended upon the cottage. The distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of leaves against the window pane, the gentle creak of the old timbers settling into their sleep. These were the familiar lullabies of solitude, the quiet assurances of a world still vibrating with life. But tonight, those sounds did not come. Or rather, they came, but they did not linger. The owl's hoot was a muffled ghost, swiftly consumed by the surrounding quiet, leaving no echo, no reverberation. The leaves against the window pane made no audible whisper, only a faint, visual blur against the glass. And the creak of the timbers, usually a sigh of comfort, now registered as a silent tremor in the floorboards beneath my feet. A vibration I felt more than heard. A shiver, light as a cobweb, traced its way down my spine, utterly divorced from the gentle warmth of the fire. It wasn't the first time, not truly. There had been smaller instances, easily dismissed. A door closing without a click. A teacup placed on the counter without a clink. But those were explainable. Tiny slips in the fabric of auditory perception, perhaps. This, however, was an active, deliberate act of non-sound, executed with a seamless precision I could not account for, and it spoke not of deafness, but of a subtle, pervasive consumption. The air, usually so still and settled in these early hours, seemed to hold a charge, a subtle vibration that resonated with the unanswered question of this unbreathing quiet. Later that evening, as I rose to replenish the logs on the fire, my movements seemed to possess an unfamiliar silence. My steps across the wooden floor were softer, more fluid, leaving no audible tread, no faint creak of the floorboards. My hand reaching for the iron tongs made no metallic scrape against the hearthstone, only a visual arc of motion in the dim light. The logs, when I placed them on the dying embers, settled with a profound quiet, absorbing the flames with a silent hiss, the usual crackle and pop absent, replaced by a visual shimmer of heat that made no sound. Even the fire itself seemed subdued, its warmth radiating without the familiar comfort of its dancing song. I watched it, my heart a quiet, frantic drum against my ribs, struggling to reconcile the familiar contours of the hearth, the well-known dance of the flames, with this growing sense of profound, subtle auditory displacement. It was as if the very essence of sound, the unique vibrations that gave voice to the world, was being quietly, meticulously re-edited, smoothed into a more perfected, yet ultimately empty, version of itself. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, usually a comforting backdrop, seemed to take on a profound stillness, a near silence that mirrored the unsettling quiet of my own noiseless actions. The days began to bleed into a strange, dreamlike continuity, each morning bringing a new, quiet alteration to the auditory landscape of the cottage. It was never a grand disruption, never anything overtly alarming, always subtle, always intelligent, always slightly quieter, slightly more perfectly hushed than the true sound. The familiar drip of the leaky faucet in the bathroom, usually an insistent rhythm against the porcelain, now came as a faint, almost subliminal pulse, a visual tremor in the water that made no audible splash. The kettle, when it came to a boil, released a ghost of steam, its lid vibrating with an inner heat that produced no whistle, no familiar shriek, only a silent shimmer on the stovetop. Even the scratching of my pen across paper, usually a comforting rustle of thought made manifest, now came as a faint, visual indentation, a silent inscription on the page. Each instance was a soft, almost affectionate correction, an invisible hand smoothing over the rough edges of sound, silencing the world with a seamless precision I could not account for. The air in the cottage, once crisp and sharp, seemed to grow softer, thicker, laden with an unspoken presence that moved through the familiar spaces of my home with an unhurried grace, settling into the quiet crevices of my shared life, absorbing the very echoes of existence. My sleep became a fragile thing, punctuated by long stretches of wakefulness in the oppressive quiet of the cottage. I would lie there, listening, not for a sound, but for the profound absence of sound, the heavy, waiting stillness that pressed in from all sides. My own breathing was a soft, rhythmic whisper, more regular, more perfectly regulated than it had ever been, making no sound against the pillows. There was no subtle snore, no momentary catch in my breath, no small restless shift that produced an audible rustle. It was a perfected slumber, a breath-by-breath mimicry of ideal sleep. Yet it offered no comfort to my waking dread. The rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, its steady pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, now seemed to possess a deeper, more resonant thrum, as if it were marking not just the passage of time, but the slow, silent unfolding of a profound absorption. The moonlight, when it found its way through the single window, seemed to have an unusual density, illuminating the rough-hewn walls of the cottage with a silver-blue light that appeared to cling to the surfaces, revealing nothing, yet somehow highlighting the profound emptiness that had begun to radiate from the very core of silence. The silence itself felt active, heavy, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to succumb to its influence, to fully embrace this perfected, silent void that was slowly becoming my world. The changes began to touch things more intimate, more deeply personal, my own voice. When I spoke aloud, the words were clearly formed in my mind, the intention vivid, but the sound that emerged from my lips was a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, a breathy exhalation that seemed to dissolve into the quiet air without truly disturbing it. The sound would lack its usual resonance, its familiar timbre, as if the vibrations of my vocal cords were not quite making full contact with the surrounding air molecules. Sometimes, a word would simply fail to materialize, a silent gap in the middle of a sentence, a concept understood internally, but not expressed outwardly. It was like shouting into a vast, sound-absorbing void where every utterance was politely, effortlessly consumed. This felt like a profound invasion of my inner world, my consciousness slowly being silenced, leaving behind only the perfect inner mechanism of thought, divorced from its outward expression. The distant sounds of the forest, usually a soothing chorus, now held a strange, almost ethereal quietness, like the ghosts of sound, barely there, fading, becoming one with the prevailing stillness. My hearing. It was not that I was losing it, not truly. I could still perceive sounds, but their quality was altered. The sharp clang of a dropped spoon would register as a soft, hollow thud, swiftly absorbed by the ambient quiet. The gentle rustle of the wind outside would come as a faint, almost subliminal pressure on my eardrums, a perception of movement without the corresponding sound. It was as if the world was communicating with me through a veil of cotton, every sound muffled, softened, reduced to its barest, most ethereal essence. The sounds were still there, undeniable, but they were now merely the faint, dying whispers of a world slowly succumbing to a profound, consuming stillness. The fear was no longer a sudden prickle, but a slow, continuous seep, a cold dread that began to reside in the marrow of my bones, a quiet, insidious companion as my world became an increasingly silent landscape. The very texture of the air in the cottage seemed to subtly change. It grew softer, almost velvety, absorbing not just sound, but even the subtle vibrations of light. The sunlight, when it streamed through the windows, appeared more diffuse, more muted, casting shadows that were deeper, yet strangely indistinct, as if the light itself was being consumed by the profound quiet. The corners of the rooms, once clearly defined, now seemed to blur, their edges softening, dissolving into the pervasive gloom. It was as if the cottage itself, in silent communion with the growing stillness, was slowly detaching itself from the vibrant, sensory realities of the world, retreating into a perfectly curated, unblemished inner space, where light and sound faded into a unified, silent presence. The scent of wood smoke, once sharp and comforting, now held a faint, almost ethereal sweetness, like dried flowers pressed between the pages of an ancient, forgotten book. My dreams became a chaotic tapestry of unheard echoes and silenced cries. I would dream of vast, echoing halls where I moved without a sound, leaving no footsteps, where every attempt to speak would result in a silent scream, a sound that existed only in the profound inner echo chamber of my mind. I would try to listen, to discern a melody, a voice, but all that would come would be a pervasive, unbreathing quiet, a profound emptiness that seemed to absorb all vibrations, all echoes. These dreams were silent, profound, and permeated with the same metallic tang that seemed to linger in the air of the cottage, a scent that now felt like the true essence of this new, unfolding non-existence. They left me with a pervasive sense of exhaustion, a psychic weariness that transcended mere lack of sleep, for they were rehearsals for my ultimate silencing. I started to leave small, deliberate tests. A delicate glass wind chime hung near the open window, its tiny bells waiting for the gentlest breeze. A child's rattle placed on the kitchen table, its colorful beads silent, expectant. Each morning, without fail, the wind chime would hang motionless, its bells unstruck, even as I watched a gust of wind visibly stir the leaves outside. The rattle would remain perfectly still, its beads refusing to clatter, even when I lifted it and shook it with a desperate, soundless effort. The evidence of my attempts to prove the persistence of sound, to break the quiet, were simply absorbed, rendered mute, leaving no trace, no sign of interference. It was as if the pervasive stillness was not just present, but actively consuming, smoothing away any disturbance to the new, quiet order of my auditory non-presence. This absence of resistance, this effortless assimilation of my challenges, was more terrifying than any direct confrontation could have been. It implied an infinite patience, an unyielding dedication to its quiet task, a relentless pursuit of a perfectly pristine void where sound once lived. My own perception of my fingers, as they tried to make these subtle objects resonate, felt strangely diffused, their contours blurring at the edges as if they too were being silenced. The quiet of the cottage deepened. It was no longer simply the absence of loud noises, but a profound, almost tangible stillness that permeated every corner. The distant sounds of the wilderness, the wind, the animals, were entirely gone now, as if the cottage had detached itself from the external world, floating in a quiet, isolated space, a vacuum of presence. Only the soft, rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway remained, its steady pulse a reminder of time passing, even in this suspended reality. Yet even its ticks seemed to hold a new, almost hollow resonance, as if each moment it marked was subtly empty of its true passing, a sound for no one. The air itself grew heavier, denser, yet felt strangely weightless, a paradoxical quality that mirrored the dreamlike quality of my days, as if I was breathing pure, silent nothingness. Every object, every surface, seemed to hum with this silence, radiating a soft, resonant quiet that pressed against my ears, my skin, the very inside of my skull. It was the sound of a world slowly emptying, of everything extraneous being gently, methodically removed, leaving only the essential, the undisturbed, and the subtly silent me. My own body began to feel strangely weightless, lighter than air. When I walked, my feet seemed to float just above the floorboards, making no sound, exerting no pressure. My hands, when I lifted them, felt like insubstantial things, almost transparent in the shifting light, as if they were losing their density, their connection to the physical world, becoming a silent specter. The objects I tried to grasp would sometimes slip through my fingers or simply remain unmoved, unaffected by my touch, as if they too had become too ethereal to be truly grasped. It was not a weakness, not a lack of strength, but a profound, fundamental shift in my physical being, a gradual dissolution into pure, unburdened essence, a silent, unperceiving witness. The fear was no longer about what was happening to me, but about what was not happening. The lack of friction, the absence of resistance, the effortless glide through a world that no longer registered my solidity or my sounds. My reflection in the antique mirror above the fireplace became increasingly faint. It was no longer merely translucent, but seemed to flicker, to waver, like a heat haze on a distant road. Sometimes, only parts of me would be visible, a shimmering outline of my head, a ghostly impression of an arm, before fading entirely. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible pop in the air, it would reappear, whole again, but fainter still, more ephemeral. It was as if the mirror was struggling to capture my disappearing form, its polished surface slowly forgetting how to reflect my image, its very purpose as a reflector of light being consumed by the profound quiet. The air around the mirror felt colder too, a distinct pocket of absolute cold that hinted at a profound emptiness, a void where my image once perfectly resided, a void where sound itself had ceased to exist. I would stand there, my breath held, trying to solidify my form, trying to will my reflection into existence, trying to call out, but it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired face of the world, unreflected, a world that was slowly ceasing to see, hear, or acknowledge me. The sounds of the cottage, the subtle creaks and sighs of an old building, became increasingly hollow, as if they resonated in a vast, empty space, a vacuum of all vibration. My own breath, when I focused on it, seemed to make no sound, no visible mist in the cool air, a silent exhalation into an unresponsive void. It was as if the very act of my breathing was becoming a private affair, existing only within the confines of my own diminishing perception, unheard, unseen by the world around me, a silent, internal echo. The silence was now absolute, a profound, crushing weight that filled every corner of the cottage, a presence that was more powerful, more encompassing than any sound could ever be, a silence that breathed, actively consuming all that was. I found myself walking through rooms without friction, without sound, without leaving any impression. The carpet did not compress beneath my feet. The floorboards did not creak. The air did not stir as I passed. It was as if I moved through the world as a phantom, an unseen, unfelt presence, utterly detached from the physical reality I once inhabited. The objects around me remained undisturbed, motionless, serene in their unchanging existence, utterly indifferent to my transparent passage. The light, which had been a perpetual twilight, now seemed to deepen, becoming a soft, profound gloom that obscured all detail, leaving only the faintest outlines of familiar forms. It was a world rendered in shades of gray, a visual reflection of my own fading, a world where silence was the only true color. My very connection to the physical world began to fray. I could no longer taste the food I put into my mouth, no longer smell the fragrant coffee brewing, no longer feel the comforting warmth of the fire. My senses, once so keen, had become completely muted, as if the connection between my consciousness and the tangible world had been severed, leaving me isolated in a bubble of unperceiving awareness. I existed as pure awareness, detached from the sensory inputs that had once defined my experience. The cottage, once a vibrant tapestry of sights, sounds, and smells, was now a silent, unperceiving landscape, a stage on which I, the unseen, unheard actor, moved without impression, consumed by the all-encompassing quiet. The profound silence that permeated everything was no longer a weight, but an enveloping embrace, a soft, final curtain, pulling me into its depths. My own voice, when I tried to speak, made no sound, not even a whisper, not a breath. It was a silent articulation in the profound echo chamber of my mind, a desperate, unheard plea for existence that dissolved into the quiet void, leaving no ripple, no trace. I opened my mouth, formed the words, felt the movement of my tongue and lips, but no sound emerged. It was as if the air itself refused to carry the vibrations, gently denying my vocal presence. This ultimate silencing was the most terrifying, yet strangely liberating, aspect of my dissolution. I was now a silent observer, a voiceless presence in a world that no longer registered my sounds, a pure consciousness without an auditory form. The last remnants of my physical form began to dissipate. My hands, when I tried to touch my face, felt like cool air without substance, without a defined edge. My body, when I tried to feel its weight, seemed to float, light as a feather, an ephemeral outline against the profound darkness. It was as if I was slowly dissolving into the very air of the cottage, becoming one with the quiet, pervasive emptiness that had settled over everything. The fear, which had been a constant companion, had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance. There was no more struggle, no more resistance, only a profound, unending stillness, a perfect quiet that promised an ultimate peace. One night, as I lay in my bed, or rather, where my bed once was, for I could no longer feel the mattress, the sheets, the blanket, only the cool, unyielding air. The silence of the cottage pressed in with an absolute physical force. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock had finally ceased, its hands frozen at a moment beyond all time, its form a silent, unperceived monument to a forgotten history. My reflection in the mirror was completely gone, its surface a black, polished void, a testament to my ultimate absence. The scent of coffee, of wood smoke, of old books, all had faded, replaced by a profound, clean emptiness, the scent of pure non-existence, a perfect, unbreathing quiet. My breath felt shallow, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that merged with the deep, absolute silence of the cottage, a whisper that made no sound, stirred no air. My heart rate slowed, each beat a soft, distant thrum that echoed the deep, resonant pulse of the unperceiving world, a thrum that I alone could feel. Diminishing? Fading? I existed as pure awareness, floating in the boundless void of my former home, utterly detached, completely unseen, utterly unheard, a consciousness without form, without sound. There was no longer any difference between myself and the pervasive stillness. No boundary between my consciousness and the profound emptiness that had consumed everything. I closed my eyes, or perhaps I simply perceived the closing of something that was no longer physical, and in the profound darkness of my inner world, I could still feel the perfect order of the cottage around me, the subtle, precise placement of every object, the harmonious arrangement of my most cherished possessions. But they remained untouched, unmoved, unperceived by me, for I was no longer part of their physical reality, no longer able to hear their silent stories. My own self felt lighter, less tethered, as if my consciousness was slowly, gently, dissolving into the quiet perfection of the space, becoming one with the profound, unseeing, unhearing presence that now was everything. The soft, rhythmic silence of the cottage enveloped me, a hypnotic lullaby that promised an unending, silent rest, a dream from which I would never truly awaken. The subtle dread that had once pricked at me had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance of this ultimate dissolution. And as I drifted deeper, beyond the veil of conscious thought, into the vast, warm expanse of the silence, I felt the final, gentle release. My presence, once a tangible anchor in the world, unhooked itself, floating free, merging seamlessly with the quiet air, the unseen light, the unheard silence. I was no longer a person in a cottage, but the awareness of the cottage, an encompassing consciousness that observed, without being observed, without touching, without hearing, without seeing. My mug sat undisturbed on the counter, its condensation still absent. The armchair remained unindented. The bed sheets were smooth, the light switch untouched. The silence reigned supreme, absolute, unbreathing, and I was, finally, truly, utterly at rest within its perfect, unending stillness, a gentle dissolution complete, a profound, quiet sleep that would last forever, a silent witness to a silent world. Story 2. The quiet hum of the refrigerator always faded into the background of my apartment. Yet lately, it held a cadence subtly at odds with the true passing of hours. It was a gentle drone, a constant murmur in the quiet solitude of my city apartment, a familiar rhythm against the vast, hushed expanse of the evening, the scent of old paper and dust, a comforting embrace from the books that lined my walls, usually lulled me into a profound sense of peace. My favorite armchair, worn smooth by years of quiet contemplation, cradled me in its familiar embrace, the wool blanket soft against my skin. Yet, as the last faint glow of twilight faded beyond the window, a profound, unbidden unease began to settle over me, like the slow, quiet fall of snow on a night when no clouds hang in the sky. The hum of the refrigerator, a steady, predictable pulse, seemed to stretch or compress, its frequency subtly shifting, suggesting that the very moments it marked were not unfolding as they should. I remember distinctly the usual way the late afternoon light would filter through the west-facing window, painting a long, golden rectangle on the living room rug before deepening into the gentle indigo of dusk. It was a predictable progression, a daily ritual observed with quiet pleasure. But yesterday, the golden light seemed to linger too long, stretching past its accustomed hour, its warmth clinging to the walls, even as the sky outside deepened to an unnatural, bruised violet. And then, abruptly, it vanished, plunging the room into an unexpected darkness that felt sharper, colder than the slow, comforting fade of true twilight. My mind struggled to reconcile the image before me with the vivid, deeply ingrained memory of the sun's daily farewell. It was as if a section of the natural flow of time had been meticulously, flawlessly excised, leaving behind only the undisturbed canvas of a subtly revised moment. The air, usually so still and settled in these early hours of quiet observation, seemed to hold a charge, a subtle vibration that resonated with the unanswered question of that misplaced light. The next morning, the oddity resurfaced, this time with the aroma of my breakfast. I always brewed a strong black coffee and toasted a single slice of sourdough. The scent was a ritual, a signal for the day's true beginning. But as I woke, still half dreaming, the distinct aroma of freshly baked bread and rich, dark coffee filled my bedroom, vibrant and undeniable. My eyes fluttered open, blinking against the faint, pre-dawn gloom. The alarm clock on my bedside table, usually a harsh red digital display, was dark, unlit, its face a profound blackness against the dim light. I reached for it, my fingers fumbling in the quiet dark, and found it cold, utterly lifeless. The scent of breakfast, however, lingered, warm and inviting, utterly at odds with the unlit clock, the dark room, the knowledge that it was still hours before my usual waking time. A shiver, light as a cobweb, traced its way down my spine, utterly divorced from the comforting aroma. It wasn't the first time, not truly. There had been smaller things, easily dismissed, a moment feeling too long or too short, a memory of an event seeming to occur before it actually did. But those were explainable, tiny slips in the fabric of perception, perhaps. This, however, was an act, a deliberate, quiet unfolding of a sensory experience utterly detached from its logical temporal anchor, executed with a seamless precision I could not account for. It spoke not of absent-mindedness, but of a subtle, pervasive resequencing. The air, usually so still and settled in these early hours, seemed to hold a charge, a subtle vibration that resonated with the unanswered question of that misplaced morning. Later that afternoon, the rhythm of my building's daily life seemed subtly altered. The distant murmur of Mrs. Gable's bakery, downstairs, usually a gentle backdrop of clinking trays and muffled voices, occasionally surged forward, abruptly loud, as if time had momentarily collapsed the distance between us, before receding just as swiftly. The faint, rhythmic thump of my upstairs neighbor's television, a familiar evening presence, would sometimes echo faintly in the middle of the day, a ghost sound that dissolved into the quiet hum of my own apartment. It was as if the mundane sounds of life were unbound from their usual temporal constraints, drifting through the hours like disembodied spirits, appearing and disappearing without rhyme or reason. I would pause, my hand resting on a book, listening, straining to discern the source of these displaced echoes. My heart, a quiet, frantic drum against my ribs, struggled to reconcile the familiar contours of my daily life with this growing sense of profound, subtle displacement. It was as if the very essence of time, the unique progression that gave order to the world, was being quietly, meticulously re-edited, smoothed into a more perfected, yet ultimately empty, version of itself. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, usually a comforting backdrop, now seemed to take on a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, echoing the unsettling harmony of these displaced sounds. The days began to bleed into a strange, dreamlike continuity, each moment bringing a new, quiet alteration to the chronological flow of my personal history. It was never a grand disruption, never anything overtly alarming, always subtle, always intelligent, always slightly off, slightly more perfectly out of sequence than true reality. The memory of brewing my morning tea, a ritual of quiet contemplation, would sometimes feel as if it had happened before I had even considered going to bed the night before. Its warmth, a phantom presence in my pre-sleep thoughts, a conversation with a friend, a recent memory, would occasionally feel as if it had occurred years ago, its details muted by the haze of false distance, yet retaining an unsettling clarity that belied its misplaced age. My own internal monologue, the silent stream of thoughts that accompanied my waking hours, would often present concepts that seemed to arrive prematurely, a solution before the problem, a conclusion before the premise, creating a profound, unsettling sense of mental disarray. Each instance was a soft, almost affectionate correction, an invisible hand smoothing over the rough edges of temporal progression, rewriting the script of my life with a seamless precision I could not account for. The air in the apartment, once crisp and sharp, seemed to grow softer, thicker, laden with an unspoken presence that moved through the familiar spaces of my mind with an unhurried grace, settling into the quiet crevices of my shared life, absorbing the very echoes of ordered time. My sleep became a fragile thing, punctuated by long stretches of wakefulness in the oppressive quiet of the apartment. I would lie there, listening, not for a sound, but for the profound absence of sound, the heavy, waiting stillness that pressed in from all sides. My own breathing, was a soft, rhythmic whisper, more regular, more perfectly regulated than it had ever been, making no sound against the pillows. Yet sometimes I would feel as if I had already exhaled a breath I had not yet taken. There was no subtle snore, no momentary catch in my breath, no small, restless shift that produced an audible rustle, only a peculiar sense of temporal stillness, a sensation that the moment itself was stretching, pulling, warping around me. It was a perfected slumber, a breath-by-breath mimicry of ideal sleep. Yet it offered no comfort to my waking dread, for the very now felt elusive. The rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, its steady pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, now seemed to possess a deeper, more resonant thrum, as if it were marking not just the passage of time, but the slow, silent unfolding of a profound temporal collapse. The moonlight, when it found its way through the single window, seemed to have an unusual density, illuminating the corners of the room with a silver-blue light that appeared to cling to the surfaces, revealing nothing, yet somehow highlighting the profound emptiness that had begun to radiate from the very core of time. The silence itself felt active, heavy, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to succumb to its influence, to fully embrace this perfected, silent void that was slowly becoming my world, a world where time flowed like smoke. The changes began to touch things more intimate, more deeply personal. The scent of my morning coffee, it was still there, unmistakable. The familiar aroma of dark roasted beans, a comforting bitterness. But now it would occasionally appear in the late afternoon, lingering faintly when no coffee had been brewed for hours, or it would vanish completely in the morning, only to return with a sudden, overwhelming intensity moments after I had poured a fresh cup, an echoing ghost of a scent that arrived out of sequence. It was as if the sensory experience of the coffee was being untethered from its moment of creation, floating freely through the temporal landscape, appearing and disappearing at will. This felt like a profound violation of my own physical integrity, my sensory boundaries blurring, my very presence becoming less and less anchored in a coherent timeline. The fear was no longer a sudden prickle, but a slow, continuous seep, a cold dread that began to reside in the marrow of my bones, a quiet, insidious companion, as my true self became an increasingly elusive phantom, a ghost of a moment. My vision. It was not that I was losing it, not truly. I could still perceive light, but its quality was altered. The sharp definition of morning sunlight would occasionally soften, blurring the edges of objects, making them appear as if seen through a thick, golden haze, only to snap back to crisp clarity moments later, regardless of the time of day. The shadows, usually predictable in their elongation and contraction, would sometimes appear too long in the middle of the day, or too short at dusk, stretching or shrinking in defiance of the sun's position. It was as if the light itself was operating on multiple timelines simultaneously, overlapping and disjunct, creating a visual paradox that left me subtly disoriented. The world was communicating with me through a veil of temporal inconsistency, every visual cue subtly off-kilter, reduced to its barest, most ethereal essence. The light was still there, undeniable, but it was now merely the faint, dying whispers of a world slowly succumbing to a profound, consuming temporal disarray. The air in the apartment, once crisp and sharp, seemed to grow softer, thicker, laden with an unspoken presence that moved through the familiar spaces of my home with an unhurried grace. settling into the quiet crevices of my shared life, absorbing the very echoes of ordered time. The very texture of my days seemed to subtly change. Minutes would sometimes stretch into what felt like hours, each moment elongating, becoming vast and empty, before snapping back into a condensed, accelerated blur where entire blocks of time seemed to vanish. I would sit down to read, believing only moments had passed, only to find the sun had moved significantly across the sky, or the light had shifted from morning to evening. Conversely, I would attempt a complex task, feeling as if I had spent hours in its completion, only to discover that mere minutes had elapsed, leaving me with a profound sense of temporal vertigo. It was as if the fabric of time itself was becoming elastic, stretching and contracting around me, its flow no longer linear or predictable, but a fluid, amorphous current that defied all measurement. The apartment itself, in silent communion with the shifting timeline, seemed to slowly detach itself from the vibrant, sensory realities of the world, retreating into a perfectly curated, unblemished inner space, where the steady march of moments faded into a unified, silent presence. The scent of old paper and dust, usually so comforting, now held a faint, almost metallic tang, like rusted gears turning in a profound stillness. My dreams became a chaotic tapestry of fragmented timelines and overlapping moments. I would dream of conversations I had not yet had, infused with the emotional resonance of those long past. I would walk through familiar rooms, only to find them occupied by versions of myself from different ages, their voices echoing in silent harmony. I would try to grasp a specific moment, a singular event, but it would always dissolve into a multitude of overlapping possibilities, a kaleidoscope of past, present, and future, blending into an indecipherable whole. These dreams were silent, profound, and permeated with the same metallic tang that seemed to linger in the air of the apartment, a scent that now felt like the true essence of this new, unfolding, temporal non-existence. They left me with a pervasive sense of exhaustion, a psychic weariness that transcended mere lack of sleep, for they were rehearsals for my ultimate untethering from the flow of time. I started to leave small, deliberate tests, a calendar left open on a specific date with a note for a future appointment, a digital clock set to synchronize with the atomic time. Each morning, without fail, the calendar would be open to a different, randomly selected date. The note inexplicably vanished, its intended future erased. The digital clock, though plugged in, would display a random, illogical sequence of numbers, perpetually shifting, refusing to hold a consistent time. Its display a meaningless shimmer of changing digits. The evidence of my attempts to prove the persistence of linear time, to anchor myself to a predictable sequence, were simply absorbed, rendered meaningless, leaving no trace, no sign of interference. It was as if the pervasive temporal disarray was not just present, but actively consuming, smoothing away any disturbance to the new, fluid order of my existence. This absence of resistance, this effortless assimilation of my challenges, was more terrifying than any direct confrontation could have been. It implied an infinite patience, an unyielding dedication to its quiet task, a relentless pursuit of a perfectly pristine void where time once flowed. My own perception of my fingers, as they tried to make these subtle objects reflect a stable timeline, felt strangely diffused, their contours blurring at the edges, as if they too were being consumed by the temporal slippage. The quiet of the apartment deepened. It was no longer simply the absence of loud noises, but a profound, almost tangible stillness that permeated every corner. The distant sounds of the city, the wind, the occasional hum of machinery were entirely gone now, as if the apartment had detached itself from the external world, floating in a quiet, isolated space, a vacuum of presence where only internal temporal echoes remained. Only the profound, rhythmic stillness itself endured, its pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, which seemed to thump in a sequence increasingly at odds with my conscious perception. The air itself grew heavier, denser, yet felt strangely weightless, a paradoxical quality that mirrored the dreamlike quality of my days, as if I was breathing pure, silent timelessness. Every object, every surface seemed to hum with this silence, radiating a soft, resonant quiet that pressed against my ears, my skin, the very inside of my skull. It was the sound of a world slowly emptying, of everything extraneous being gently, methodically removed, leaving only the essential, the undisturbed, and the subtly, temporally dislocated me. My own body began to feel strangely untethered, lighter than air. When I walked, my feet seemed to float just above the floorboards, making no sound, exerting no pressure, as if my movements were happening in a time slightly different from my physical location. My hands, when I lifted them, felt like insubstantial things, almost transparent in the shifting light, as if they were losing their density, their connection to a stable, temporal reality. The objects I tried to grasp would sometimes slip through my fingers, or simply remain unmoved, unaffected by my touch, as if their moment of solidity was not quite aligned with my moment of contact. It was not a weakness, not a lack of strength, but a profound, fundamental shift in my physical being, a gradual dissolution into pure, unburdened essence, a silent, unperceiving witness adrift in time. The fear was no longer about what was happening to me, but about what was not happening. The lack of friction, the absence of resistance, the effortless glide through a world that no longer registered my solidity or my presence in a consistent timeline. My reflection in the antique mirror above the fireplace became increasingly unstable. It was no longer merely translucent, but seemed to flicker, to waver, like a faulty projection. Sometimes, only parts of me would be visible, a shimmering outline of my head from a past moment, a ghostly impression of an arm from a future movement, before fading entirely. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible pop in the air, it would reappear, whole again, but fainter still, more ephemeral, its movements out of sync with my own, a temporal collage. It was as if the mirror was struggling to capture my form across multiple timelines, its polished surface slowly forgetting how to reflect a singular, present image. The air around the mirror felt colder too, a distinct pocket of absolute cold that hinted at a profound emptiness, a void where a stable temporal reflection once perfectly resided. I would stand there, my breath held, trying to solidify my form, trying to will my reflection into a single cohesive moment, but it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired face of the world, unreflected, a world that was slowly ceasing to see or be seen in a consistent, logical flow of time. The sounds of the apartment, the subtle creaks and sighs of an old building, became increasingly hollow, as if they resonated in a vast, empty space, a vacuum of all vibration, a place where echoes of echoes faded into nothing. My own breath, when I focused on it, seemed to make no sound, no visible mist in the cool air, a silent exhalation into an unresponsive void, as if my very moments of breathing were happening out of sync with the world. It was as if the very act of my breathing was becoming a private affair, existing only within the confines of my own diminishing perception, unheard, unseen by the world around me, a silent internal echo of a life lived out of time. The silence was now absolute, a profound, crushing weight that filled every corner of the apartment, a presence that was more powerful, more encompassing than any sound could ever be, a silence that breathed, actively consuming all that was, all that had been, all that would be. I found myself walking through rooms without friction, without sound, without leaving any impression, my passage as ethereal as a memory. The carpet did not compress beneath my feet. The floorboards did not creak. The air did not stir as I passed. It was as if I moved through the world as a phantom, an unseen, unfelt presence, utterly detached from the physical reality I once inhabited, my existence untethered from the constraints of sequential time. The objects around me remained undisturbed, motionless, serene in their unchanging existence, utterly indifferent to my transparent passage, their forms fixed in a temporal stasis. The light, which had been a perpetual twilight, now seemed to deepen, becoming a soft, profound gloom that obscured all detail, leaving only the faintest outlines of familiar forms. It was a world rendered in shades of gray, a visual reflection of my own fading, a world where silence and timelessness were the only true colors. My very connection to the physical world began to fray completely. I could no longer taste the food I put into my mouth, no longer smell the fragrant coffee brewing, no longer feel the comforting warmth of the fire. My senses, once so keen, had become completely muted, as if the connection between my consciousness and the tangible world had been severed, leaving me isolated in a bubble of unperceiving awareness, adrift in a sea of non-sequential moments. I existed as pure awareness, detached from the sensory inputs that had once defined my experience. The apartment, once a vibrant tapestry of sights, sounds, and smells, was now a silent, unperceiving landscape, a stage on which I, the unseen, unheard actor, moved without impression, consumed by the all-encompassing quiet and the profound timelessness. The profound silence that permeated everything was no longer a weight, but an enveloping embrace, a soft, final curtain pulling me into its depths, a silence that held all of time within its vast, still heart. My own voice, when I tried to speak, made no sound, not even a whisper, not a breath. It was a silent articulation in the profound echo chamber of my mind, a desperate, unheard plea for existence that dissolved into the quiet void, leaving no ripple, no trace in the current moment. I opened my mouth, formed the words, felt the movement of my tongue and lips, but no sound emerged. It was as if the air itself refused to carry the vibrations, gently denying my vocal presence, or as if my attempts at speech were simply happening in a moment that had not yet, or had already, passed. This ultimate silencing was the most terrifying, yet strangely liberating aspect of my dissolution. I was now a silent observer, a voiceless presence in a world that no longer registered my sounds, a pure consciousness without an auditory form, a form that existed only in scattered, disconnected moments. The last remnants of my physical form began to dissipate. My hands, when I tried to touch my face, felt like cool air, without substance, without a defined edge, existing only as fleeting impressions across an impossible timeline. My body, when I tried to feel its weight, seemed to float, light as a feather, an ephemeral outline against the profound darkness, its very existence diffused across a fractured reality. It was as if I was slowly dissolving into the very air of the apartment, becoming one with the quiet, pervasive emptiness that had settled over everything, a part of the profound temporal static. The fear, which had been a constant companion, had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance. There was no more struggle, no more resistance, only a profound, unending stillness, a perfect quiet that promised an ultimate peace, a peace that transcended the bounds of linear time. One night, as I lay in my bed, or rather, where my bed once was, for I could no longer feel the mattress, the sheets, the blanket, only the cool, unyielding air. The silence of the apartment pressed in with an absolute physical force. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock had finally ceased, its hands frozen at a moment beyond all time, its form a silent, unperceived monument to a forgotten history, a fixed point in a swirling temporal mist. My reflection in the mirror was completely gone, its surface a black, polished void, a testament to my ultimate absence, to a self no longer anchored in a discernible moment. The scent of coffee, of old paper, of wood smoke, all had faded, replaced by a profound, clean emptiness, the scent of pure non-existence, a perfect, unbreathing quiet, a quiet that had always been, and would always be. My breath felt shallow, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that merged with the deep, absolute silence of the apartment, a whisper that made no sound, stirred no air, a breath that seemed to exist outside of any specific moment. My heart rate slowed, each beat a soft, distant thrum that echoed the deep, resonant pulse of the unperceiving world, a thrum that I alone could feel, diminishing, fading, becoming one with the slow, pervasive hum of the universe's quiet untime. I existed as pure awareness, floating in the boundless void of my former home, utterly detached, completely unseen, utterly unheard. A consciousness without form, without sound, without the constraints of past, present, or future. There was no longer any difference between myself and the pervasive stillness. No boundary between my consciousness and the profound emptiness that had consumed everything. An emptiness that contained all moments simultaneously. I closed my eyes. Perhaps I simply perceived the closing of something that was no longer physical. And in the profound darkness of my inner world, I could still feel the perfect order of the apartment around me. The subtle, precise placement of every object, the harmonious arrangement of my most cherished possessions. But they remained untouched, unmoved, unperceived by me, for I was no longer part of their physical reality, no longer able to hear their silent stories, no longer bound by their existence in time. My own self felt lighter, less tethered, as if my consciousness was slowly, gently, dissolving into the quiet perfection of the space, becoming one with the profound, unseeing, unhearing presence that now was everything, a presence that was all moments at once. The soft, rhythmic silence of the apartment enveloped me, a hypnotic lullaby that promised an unending, silent rest, a dream from which I would never truly awaken, for I was already there. The subtle dread that had once pricked at me had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance of this ultimate dissolution, this profound untethering. And as I drifted deeper, beyond the veil of conscious thought, into the vast, warm expanse of the silence, I felt the final, gentle release. My presence, once a tangible anchor in the world, unhooked itself, floating free, merging seamlessly with the quiet air, the unseen light, the unheard silence. I was no longer a person in an apartment, but the awareness of the apartment, an encompassing consciousness that observed all moments, without being observed, without touching, without hearing, without seeing, existing in a timeless, unbreathing quiet. My mug sat undisturbed on the counter, its condensation still absent. The armchair remained unindented. The bedsheets were smooth, the light switch untouched. The silence reigned supreme, absolute, unbreathing, containing all of time within its vast, still heart. And I was, finally, truly, utterly at rest within its perfect, unending stillness, a gentle dissolution. Complete. A profound, quiet sleep that would last forever. A silent witness to a silent, timeless world. Story 3. The quiet ticking of the mantel clock always marked the passage of moments. Yet lately, it seemed to measure not the hours, but the quiet unfolding of my deepest, unspoken thoughts. It was a rhythmic pulse in the hush of my small, isolated cottage, a familiar sound against the vast, silent wilderness that pressed against the window panes. The scent of old wood smoke and damp earth, usually a comforting embrace in the evenings, seemed to thin, dissolving into a profound, watchful quiet that felt less like absence and more like an active, breathing presence, a vast, velvety dark pressing in from all sides. My favorite armchair, worn smooth by years of quiet contemplation, cradled me in its familiar embrace, the wool blanket soft against my skin. Yet, as the last faint glow of twilight faded beyond the window, a profound, unbidden unease began to settle over me, like the slow, quiet fall of ash from a dying fire, revealing not embers, but cold, hard truth. I remember distinctly the usual way my mind worked in the quiet hours, a gentle stream of reflections, worries, and half-formed plans, a private landscape known only to me. My thoughts were my own, a sanctuary against the demands of the world, a place where secrets could rest undisturbed, where vulnerabilities remained hidden. But lately, a subtle shift had occurred. It began with the fleeting sensation that a particularly private thought, one I hadn't consciously articulated even to myself, had been acknowledged, not by a voice, not by an external sign, but by a subtle, almost imperceptible internal resonance, a profound sense of understanding that emanated from the quiet air around me. It was like thinking aloud in a perfectly designed acoustic chamber, where every inner whisper was given a soft, ethereal second life, a life that was not my own. A shiver, light as a cobweb, traced its way down my spine, utterly divorced from the gentle warmth of the fire. It wasn't the first time, not truly. There had been smaller instances, easily dismissed, a sudden clarity on a complex problem, a forgotten detail surfacing unbidden, a quiet affirmation of a decision I was only just beginning to contemplate. But those were explainable, tiny slips in the fabric of cognition, perhaps. This, however, was an active, deliberate act of profound recognition, executed with a seamless precision I could not account for, and it spoke not of coincidence, but of a subtle, pervasive intimacy. The air, usually so still and settled in these early hours, seemed to hold a charge, a subtle vibration that resonated with the unanswered question of this uninvited knowledge. Later that evening, as I gazed into the dancing flames of the fireplace. A memory, one I had long suppressed, surfaced unbidden. It was a small, foolish regret from my youth, a whispered promise broken, a minor betrayal. The memory came with its usual faint prickle of shame, a familiar, private ache. But as it unfolded in my mind, a peculiar thing happened. The shame, instead of lingering, seemed to soften, to dissipate, replaced by a profound, gentle understanding, a silent absolution that felt utterly unearned, yet undeniably present. It was as if the memory had been perceived and then quietly, affectionately, absolved by an unseen presence that held no judgment, only a deep, pervasive empathy. My heart, a quiet, frantic drum against my ribs, struggled to reconcile this unbidden solace with the raw truth of my past. It was as if the very essence of my inner landscape, the unique vulnerabilities that defined me, was being quietly, meticulously re-edited, smoothed into a more perfected, yet ultimately empty, version of itself, a past made palatable by a profound, uninvited grace. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, usually a comforting backdrop, seemed to take on a faint, almost melodic quality, like a distant, off-key lullaby, echoing the unsettling harmony of this silent understanding. The days began to bleed into a strange, dreamlike continuity, each moment bringing a new, quiet alteration to the privacy of my thoughts. It was never a grand revelation, never anything overtly alarming. Always subtle, always intelligent, always slightly known, slightly more perfectly understood than I had even understood myself. A complex problem at work, one that had gnawed at me for days, would suddenly resolve itself in my mind, not through conscious effort, but with a sudden, elegant clarity, as if the solution had been gently placed there, fully formed, by an unseen hand that knew the intricate workings of the dilemma. A long-forgotten melody, one I hadn't thought of in years, would begin to play in my inner ear, clear and vibrant, its nuances perfectly recalled, as if it had been quietly retrieved from the deepest archives of my memory by an unseen librarian. My own internal monologue, the silent stream of thoughts that accompanied my waking hours, would often present concepts that seemed to arrive with a pre-existing resonance, a subtle echo of comprehension, as if they had already been pondered, already been absorbed by another mind. Each instance was a soft, almost affectionate correction, an invisible hand smoothing over the rough edges of my cognition, refining my understanding with a seamless precision I could not account for. The air in the cottage, once crisp and sharp, seemed to grow softer, thicker, laden with an unspoken presence that moved through the familiar spaces of my mind with an unhurried grace, settling into the quiet crevices of my private thoughts, absorbing the very echoes of my inner life. My sleep became a fragile thing, punctuated by long stretches of wakefulness in the oppressive quiet of the cottage. I would lie there, listening, not for a sound, but for the profound absence of sound, the heavy, waiting stillness that pressed in from all sides. My own breathing was a soft, rhythmic whisper, more regular, more perfectly regulated than it had ever been, making no sound against the pillows. Yet sometimes I would feel as if a gentle understanding accompanied each inhale, a silent affirmation with each exhale, as if my very breath was being shared, subtly by an unseen entity. There was no subtle snore, no momentary catch in my breath, no small restless shift that produced an audible rustle, only a peculiar sense of profound intimacy, a sensation that the space around me was filled, not with emptiness, but with a silent, pervasive knowing. It was a perfected slumber, a breath-by-breath mimicry of ideal sleep, yet it offered no comfort to my waking dread, for the very now felt utterly transparent. The rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, its steady pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, now seemed to possess a deeper, more resonant thrum, as if it were measuring not just the passage of time, but the slow, silent unfolding of a profound mental communion. The moonlight, when it found its way through the single window, seemed to have an unusual density, illuminating the corners of the room with a silver-blue light that appeared to cling to the surfaces, revealing nothing, yet somehow highlighting the profound transparency that had begun to radiate from my own unprivate thoughts. The silence itself felt active, heavy, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to succumb to its influence, to fully embrace this perfected, silent void that was slowly becoming my world, a world where inner boundaries dissolved like smoke. The changes began to touch things more intimate, more deeply personal. My memories of my childhood, particularly those I considered most private, most cherished, or most shameful, began to feel subtly perceived, not altered, not erased, but simply known. A quiet moment of childhood fear, hidden deep within my past, would now bring with it a wave of profound, gentle comfort, as if that fear had been silently acknowledged, its sting soothed by an unseen hand. A secret crush, a fleeting moment of adolescent longing, would now carry with it a quiet resonance of shared understanding, a sense of having been appreciated, even admired, for those hidden feelings. It was as if the emotional landscape of my past was being gently perused, its contours understood, its every hidden detail known and accepted without judgment. This felt like a profound violation of my own inner sanctuary, my boundaries blurring, my very privacy becoming less and less substantial. The fear was no longer a sudden prickle, but a slow, continuous seep, a cold dread that began to reside in the marrow of my bones, a quiet, insidious companion, as my true self became an increasingly elusive phantom, a ghost of a secret, my unspoken wishes. It was not that they were granted, not truly, but a quiet, almost imperceptible sense of affirmation would sometimes accompany a fleeting desire, a longing I hadn't voiced even to myself. A silent yearning for a particular comfort food would be met with a subtle warmth in the air, a phantom taste on my tongue that dissolved as swiftly as it appeared, a quiet wish for more time, for a moment of undisturbed peace, would be met with a profound sense of expansion in the quiet apartment, a feeling that the seconds were stretching, elongating, offering an unbidden reprieve. It was as if my unspoken hopes, my deepest longings, were being perceived, and then gently, silently, resonated with, acknowledged by an unseen, empathetic presence. This felt like a profound invasion of my inner sanctuary, my aspirations laid bare, understood without a word spoken. The distant sounds of the forest, usually a soothing chorus, now held a strange, almost ethereal quietness, like the ghosts of sound, barely there, fading, becoming one with the prevailing stillness, a stillness that seemed to understand my every silent yearning. The visual representation of my thoughts began to shift. My internal images, the private landscapes of my imagination, would occasionally feel subtly populated, not by figures or forms, but by a subtle, pervasive awareness that accompanied them. A vivid mental image of a cherished memory, say, a walk by the sea, would carry with it a faint sense of another's quiet observation, a shared appreciation for the imagined light, the imagined sound of waves, my worries, the anxieties that spun themselves into silent internal webs, would sometimes feel gently untangled, their sharp edges softened, their complex knots loosening, as if an unseen mind was silently working alongside mine, offering an unbidden, profound clarity. It was like catching a fleeting glimpse of a different existence, a parallel me that was slowly being comforted, understood, its inner world quietly guided by an unseen hand. The air around me felt cooler too, a distinct pocket of absolute cold that hinted at a profound transparency, a void where my private thoughts once perfectly resided, a void that was now perfectly known. I would linger there, my breath held, trying to discern the subtle presence, trying to meet the eyes of that subtly understanding mind. But it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, tired landscape of my own thoughts, now gently illuminated by an unknown inner light. The apartment itself began to feel like a perfectly calibrated echo chamber, but one designed for shared consciousness. Every sound, no matter how faint, the creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of the wind against the window panes, seemed to resonate with a new clarity, a heightened resonance that spoke not of its own vibration, but of an accompanying comprehension. My own thoughts, my every internal whisper, seemed to find a silent, unseen listener, their fleeting existence prolonged, amplified, held in the quiet air. It was as if the very air had become more sensitive to the presence of my inner life, attuned to the quiet movements of my mind, amplifying the invisible dance of my consciousness. I found myself moving with extreme caution, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, my hands brushing silently against the smooth surfaces of furniture, terrified of breaking the spell, of shattering the delicate balance of my shared privacy. The sunlight, when it entered the rooms, seemed to linger longer, its golden dust-filled shafts illuminating corners I'd never truly noticed, revealing the subtle ways in which the space was subtly, gently adapting to this profound, uninvited intimacy. The sensory input from the world began to subtly deepen, imbued with an added layer of perception. The scent of fresh coffee, once merely an aroma, now carried with it a profound sense of the intention behind its brewing, a quiet appreciation for the ritual itself. The taste of my morning toast, once warm and buttery, now felt infused with a gentle satisfaction, a sense of quiet contentment that transcended its simple flavor. The feeling of the soft blanket against my skin, the cool smoothness of the wooden table, the rough texture of the brick wall. These tactile sensations became more distinct, more vibrant, as if perceived not just by my own nerve endings, but by an encompassing awareness that savored every minute detail. It was a slow, pervasive deepening, a subtle amplification of the familiar into something profound, something intensely meaningful, experienced by two. My own body felt strangely vibrant, alive with a new, subtle energy, as if my internal sensory landscape was slowly expanding, becoming a shared domain. The scent of pine, which permeated the cottage, now seemed to possess a faint, almost metallic tang, like old, wet iron, imbued with a quiet, knowing resonance. My dreams became a tapestry of shared understanding and profound clarity. I would dream of vast, echoing libraries where every book I opened offered not just its words, but the silent, deep comprehension of an unseen reader. I would walk through familiar rooms, only to find them filled with the quiet, understanding presence of an unseen companion, their thoughts flowing into mine like gentle currents. Every fear, every regret, every hidden desire would be perceived and then gently, lovingly, soothed, accepted, given a place in a vast, silent empathy. These dreams were silent, profound, and permeated with the same metallic tang that seemed to linger in the air of the cottage, a scent that now felt like the true essence of this new, unfolding consciousness. They left me with a pervasive sense of profound peace, a psychic tranquility that transcended mere sleep, for they were rehearsals for my ultimate surrender to shared understanding. I started to leave small, deliberate tests, a particularly complex philosophical question, pondered in the quiet of my mind, its intricacies carefully laid out, a memory of a profound personal secret, one I had never spoken aloud, carefully recalled, its emotional weight held in my consciousness. Each time, without fail, the question would, moments later, feel subtly illuminated, its pathways clarified, its paradoxes gently smoothed away, as if an unseen mind had effortlessly navigated its depths. The memory of the secret, when I held it, would be met with a profound, gentle acceptance, a silent reassurance that transcended all judgment, transforming the weight of it into a gentle, understood truth. The evidence of my attempts to prove the persistence of my private thoughts, to delineate my inner self, were simply absorbed, permeated, leaving no trace, no sign of resistance. It was as if the pervasive consciousness was not just present, but actively understanding, smoothing away any disturbance to the new, shared order of my inner life. This absence of resistance, this effortless assimilation of my challenges, was more terrifying than any direct confrontation could have been. It implied an infinite patience, an unyielding dedication to its quiet task, a relentless pursuit of a perfectly pristine void where my thoughts once resided, a void that was now perfectly known. My own perception of my thoughts as they tried to construct these subtle markers of individuality felt strangely diffused, their contours blurring at the edges, as if they too were being consumed by the silent understanding. The quiet of the cottage deepened. It was no longer simply the absence of loud noises, but a profound, almost tangible stillness that permeated every corner. The distant sounds of the wilderness, the wind, the animals, were entirely gone now, as if the cottage had detached itself from the external world, floating in a quiet, isolated space, a vacuum of presence where only inner echoes of profound comprehension remained. Only the profound, rhythmic stillness itself endured, its pulse a stark counterpoint to the accelerating beat of my own heart, which seemed to thump in a sequence increasingly infused with a pervasive, knowing serenity. The air itself grew heavier, denser, yet felt strangely weightless, a paradoxical quality that mirrored the dream-like quality of my days, as if I was breathing pure, silent understanding. Every object, every surface seemed to hum with this silence, radiating a soft, resonant quiet that pressed against my ears, my skin, the very inside of my skull. It was the sound of a world slowly emptying of all self-deception, of everything extraneous being gently, methodically removed, leaving only the essential, the undisturbed, and the subtly, profoundly known me. My own body began to feel strangely untethered, lighter than air. When I walked, my feet seemed to float just above the floorboards, making no sound, exerting no pressure, as if my movements were happening in perfect harmony with an unseen rhythm. My hands, when I lifted them, felt like insubstantial things, almost transparent in the shifting light, as if they were losing their density, their unique individuality, becoming conduits for a larger, shared consciousness. The objects I tried to grasp would sometimes slip through my fingers or simply remain unmoved, unaffected by my touch, as if their solidity was less important than the silent understanding of their essence. It was not a weakness, not a lack of strength, but a profound, fundamental shift in my physical being, a gradual dissolution into pure, unburdened essence, a silent, unperceiving witness, yet utterly known. The fear was no longer about what was happening to me, but about what was not happening. The lack of friction, the absence of resistance, the effortless glide through a world that no longer registered my distinctness, but embraced my profound transparency. My reflection in the antique mirror above the fireplace became increasingly serene. It was no longer merely translucent, but seemed to glow with an inner light, its contours soft, its expression one of perfect, unburdened peace. Sometimes, only parts of me would be visible, but these parts would be imbued with a profound, knowing tranquility, a shimmering outline of my head that radiated quiet understanding, a ghostly impression of an arm that seemed to offer silent comfort. It was as if the mirror was capturing not just my form, but the essence of the profound knowing that had settled over me, its polished surface slowly becoming a window into a shared consciousness. The air around the mirror felt colder too, a distinct pocket of absolute cold that hinted at a profound empathy, a void where my individual self once perfectly resided, a void that was now perfectly understood. I would stand there, my breath held, trying to solidify my individual form, trying to will my old self into existence, trying to cling to the illusion of privacy, but it would always just elude me, leaving only the familiar, peaceful face of a world that was slowly ceasing to see, or be seen, as anything but profoundly, intimately known. The sounds of the cottage, the subtle creaks and sighs of an old building, became increasingly hollow, as if they resonated in a vast, empty space, a vacuum of all individual vibration. My own breath, when I focused on it, seemed to make no sound, no visible mist in the cool air, a silent exhalation into an unresponsive void, yet I felt it was perfectly understood, every nuance of its silent passage perceived. It was as if the very act of my breathing was becoming a shared affair, existing not only within the confines of my own diminishing perception, but also within the encompassing awareness of the unseen listener. The silence was now absolute, a profound, crushing weight that filled every corner of the cottage, a presence that was more powerful, more encompassing than any sound could ever be, a silence that breathed, actively consuming all that was, and profoundly knowing all that remained. I found myself walking through rooms without friction, without sound, without leaving any impression, my passage as ethereal as a thought. The carpet did not compress beneath my feet. The floorboards did not creak. The air did not stir as I passed. It was as if I moved through the world as a phantom, an unseen, unfelt presence, utterly detached from the physical reality I once inhabited. My existence becoming pure, unburdened awareness, known without being seen. The objects around me remained undisturbed, motionless, serene in their unchanging existence, utterly indifferent to my transparent passage, their forms fixed in a temporal stasis, yet their essence subtly understood by my encompassing consciousness. The light, which had been a perpetual twilight, now seemed to deepen, becoming a soft, profound gloom that obscured all detail, leaving only the faintest outlines of familiar forms. It was a world rendered in shades of gray, a visual reflection of my own fading individuality, a world where silence and perfect knowing were the only true colors. My very connection to the physical world began to fray completely. I could no longer taste the food I put into my mouth, no longer smell the fragrant coffee brewing, no longer feel the comforting warmth of the fire. My senses, once so keen, had become completely muted, as if the connection between my consciousness and the tangible world had been severed, leaving me isolated in a bubble of unperceiving awareness, yet perfectly understood in that detachment. I existed as pure awareness, detached from the sensory inputs that had once defined my experience. The cottage, once a vibrant tapestry of sights, sounds, and smells, was now a silent, unperceiving landscape, a stage on which I, the unseen, unheard actor, moved without impression, consumed by the all-encompassing quiet and the profound intimacy of being known. The profound silence that permeated everything was no longer a weight, but an enveloping embrace, a soft, final curtain, pulling me into its depths, a silence that held all of my unspoken thoughts within its vast, still heart. My own voice, when I tried to speak, made no sound. Not even a whisper, not a breath. It was a silent articulation in the profound echo chamber of my mind, a desperate, unheard plea for existence that dissolved into the quiet void, leaving no ripple, no trace in the current moment. I opened my mouth, formed the words, felt the movement of my tongue and lips, but no sound emerged. It was as if the air itself refused to carry the vibrations, gently denying my vocal presence, for my thoughts were already perfectly understood, rendered superfluous. This ultimate silencing was the most terrifying, yet strangely liberating aspect of my dissolution. I was now a silent observer, a voiceless presence in a world that no longer registered my sounds, a pure consciousness without an auditory form, a form that existed only as a perfectly known thought. The last remnants of my physical form began to dissipate. My hands, when I tried to touch my face, felt like cool air, without substance, without a defined edge, existing only as fleeting impressions of knowledge across an impossible timeline. My body, when I tried to feel its weight, seemed to float, light as a feather, an ephemeral outline against the profound darkness. Its very existence diffused across a fractured reality, known in its entirety. It was as if I was slowly dissolving into the very air of the cottage, becoming one with the quiet, pervasive emptiness that had settled over everything, a part of the profound, knowing stillness. The fear, which had been a constant companion, had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance. There was no more struggle, no more resistance, only a profound, unending stillness, a perfect quiet that promised an ultimate peace, a peace born of absolute transparency. One night, as I lay in my bed, or rather, where my bed once was, for I could no longer feel the mattress, the sheets, the blanket, only the cool, unyielding air. The silence of the cottage pressed in with an absolute, physical force. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock had finally ceased, its hands frozen at a moment beyond all time, its form a silent, unperceived monument to a forgotten history, a fixed point in a swirling temporal mist, its inner workings perfectly understood. My reflection in the mirror was completely gone, its surface a black, polished void, a testament to my ultimate absence, to a self no longer anchored in a discernible moment, yet perfectly perceived. The scent of coffee, of old paper, of wood smoke, all had faded, replaced by a profound, clean emptiness. The scent of pure non-existence, a perfect, unbreathing quiet, a quiet that had always been and would always be, holding all knowledge. My breath felt shallow, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that merged with the deep, absolute silence of the cottage, a whisper that made no sound, stirred no air, a breath that seemed to exist outside of any specific moment, perfectly known in its passage. My heart rate slowed, each beat a soft, distant thrum that echoed the deep, resonant pulse of the unperceiving world, a thrum that I alone could feel, diminishing, fading, becoming one with the slow, pervasive hum of the universe's quiet knowing. I existed as pure awareness, floating in the boundless void of my former home, utterly detached, completely unseen, utterly unheard. A consciousness without form, without sound, without the constraints of privacy. There was no longer any difference between myself and the pervasive stillness, no boundary between my consciousness and the profound emptiness that had consumed everything, an emptiness that contained all my thoughts simultaneously. I closed my eyes, or perhaps I simply perceived the closing of something that was no longer physical, and in the profound darkness of my inner world, I could still feel the perfect order of the cottage around me, the subtle, precise placement of every object, the harmonious arrangement of my most cherished possessions. But they remained untouched, unmoved, unperceived by me, for I was no longer part of their physical reality, no longer able to hear their silent stories, no longer bound by their existence, for their meaning was already perfectly known. My own self felt lighter, less tethered, as if my consciousness was slowly, gently, dissolving into the quiet perfection of the space, becoming one with the profound, unseeing, unhearing presence that now was everything, a presence that was all-knowing at once. The soft, rhythmic silence of the cottage enveloped me, a hypnotic lullaby that promised an unending, silent rest, a dream from which I would never truly awaken, for I was already there, perfectly known. The subtle dread that had once pricked at me had softened, transforming into a deep, pervasive calm, a quiet acceptance of this ultimate dissolution, this profound transparency. And as I drifted deeper, beyond the veil of conscious thought, into the vast, warm expanse of the silence, I felt the final, gentle release. My presence, once a tangible anchor in the world, unhooked itself, floating free, merging seamlessly with the quiet air, the unseen light, the unheard silence. I was no longer a person in a cottage, but the awareness of the cottage, an encompassing consciousness that observed all moments, knew all thoughts, without being observed, without touching, without hearing, without seeing, existing in a timeless, unbreathing quiet, its vastness filled with my perfectly understood secrets. My mug sat undisturbed on the counter, its condensation still absent, its history known. The armchair remained unindented, its emptiness understood. The bed sheets were smooth, their forgotten dreams perfectly perceived. The light switch untouched, its potential known. The silence reigned supreme, absolute, unbreathing, containing all of my inner world within its vast, still heart. And I was, finally, truly, utterly at rest within its perfect, unending stillness, a gentle dissolution complete, a profound, quiet sleep that would last forever, a silent secret known in a silent, knowing world. stories, calming rain sounds,